Keto and crime, keto and crime. We uncover the grime on keto and crime. Keto and crime, keto and crime. Now is the time for keto and crime.
Hey everyone, welcome to Keto and Crime. Today I've got my first in my mini installments of mad medical experiments. We're going to start off with one that was done around World War II here in the United States, known as the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. Classy. Anyway, this one's going to be a lot of fun. I was actually shocked at this study. Now, you have to remember in the 1940s, this was, well, we'll get into that. First, I want to say thank you to everybody that has supported me throughout 2016 through currently, because that's when I started my channel. I really appreciate all my patrons, all my members. I will be getting back to regular live streaming, hopefully weekly. I will be live streaming my first live stream of 2022 this Friday as we discuss the updates in the Delphi murders. If you'd like to support the channel, those links are down below. And if you'd like to support my sponsor, because there's one thing that will prevent starvation, since we're talking about starvation experiment, Keto Crisp. I use it daily to stave off cravings as I go back into my weight loss journey. I'm hoping the final weight loss journey of my life. Hopefully I will keep it off this time. But I am doing Noom with a keto twist and Keto Crisp. They've been wonderful sponsors, wonderful friends to this channel, and they are tasty, they are plant-based, and you can feel good about eating them. Great macros for no matter what kind of eating plan you're on. So the link to that down below with a discount code. And with that being said, let's jump in to the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. All right. So as I was saying, this experiment took place in the 1940s, during World War II, long before we had the current standards that we do when it comes to experimenting on human beings. So it was just kind of, you could put a study out there as long as you weren't actively killing anyone. You could have human test subjects as long as they consented. And so that's what we have here. Now, during the time that this experiment was going on, we were engulfed in World War II. And this actually took place between 1944 and 1945. So the experiment didn't end until after World War II, even after the Pacific theater. So, but what they were looking at is the mass famine, the mass waves of starvation that had ravaged Europe and other parts of the world, such as, some of the Pacific Island region with Japan. And they were kind of wanting to see what the long-term effects of a famine and starvation like that would be on the human body, and what is the proper way to refeed to get people back up to fighting strength, so to speak. That was the reasoning for this experiment. And the only way to do this during this time period is with humans, because they're looking to, there was no time to do it on animals or anything like that. So and I don't want to get into the ethics of animal testing. Don't like animal testing 99.9% of the time, but when it comes down to animal versus, human, we're tribal, let's just face it. But anyway, so they had to use humans. And they wanted to see how to properly refeed the people of Europe and other places that were being ravaged by famine. So a study was concocted, and it took place between November of 1944, December of 1945, so about 13 months, and the data was not available until way after that. But they wanted to systematically semi-starve a group of healthy adult men, because that was their baseline. Remember, this is 1940. That was their baseline. And see what the effects would be physically, psychologically, emotionally, and then what would happen as they began a systematic refeed, and would the body ever recover. So the call went out for volunteers. And so even before they had selected the scientists that were going to oversee this experiment, they started looking for test subjects. They wanted to do it on approximately 35 to 50. They settled on the number of 36 healthy white men. Remember, this is the 1940s. And they did it in agreement and in collaboration with the Civilian Public Service. And they looked to the ranks of conscientious objectors. Now, these were people that, because of religious reasons, usually would not enlist in the Army, would not enlist in the armed services, were not eligible for the draft because of religious and moral reasons. They were pacifists. Think Quakers. Think, I believe to a certain extent, Seventh Day Adventists. Think anyone that has a conscientious, moral, religious, or philosophical beef, if you will, against fighting in an armed conflict. So these are not draft dodgers. I don't want anybody to think these are people that burned their draft card, tried to run off to Canada. I know that was more of a Vietnam thing. But I don't want anybody to think that that was the type. No, conscientious objectors is a totally different category. They have a deep felt, disdain for violence, and they are recognized by the government as being allowed to do that, and therefore they are not drafted, nor are they even required to submit to every part of selective service, which is wherever all men over the age of 18 register for the draft, in addition. Now, but most of them are very patriotic. It's not that they don't love their country, and in exchange for not having to fight in an armed conflict because of these deep felt beliefs, they do civil service. And so it was from the ranks of these conscientious objectors that were doing civil service for the betterment of the country, betterment of humanity, that these 36 normal weight, healthy white men were chosen. So they considered this service to the world because they were looking into how to properly refeed the people of Europe after the travesty that was World War II. So, and now for the scientists that were involved in this experiment, the lead investigator was physiologist 𝐲𝐿. And if you know anything about keto or anything like that, you know how controversial 𝐲𝐿 is. Now, I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of the controversy, but he lived from January 1904 to November of 2004. He was not only the chief investigator, chief scientist on the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, but he was also the chief investigation on what is known as the 7 countries study, which is what originated what we know as the lipid hypothesis, which, if you know anything about heart disease or keto, you know how controversial that is. They say he cherry-picked data, but basically that was the one that studied 7 countries around the world and came to name saturated fat from animal products and high cholesterol as the chief cause of heart disease. Now, there's been a lot of research on this, and it's come that maybe it's not cholesterol, maybe it's not animal fat that's the problem, maybe it's other things, combined with that is the problem. I'm not going to get into that. If you want me to do a more in-depth on the 7 country study and the controversy around it, let me know down below. I'd be happy to do that. But basically, that's the one that put us on the track to low fat, moderate protein, higher carb way of eating in this country. The diet, lipid, heart disease hypothesis as a result of the 7 country study. He was the one that did that, and he was also the creator of MREs for the military. He was the one that led that study and developed the freeze-dried, dehydrated MREs that are a staple of military cuisine now. It was that he developed them as a way to supplement fresh food dieting, but realized that, maybe that fresh food for the military is not the best way, especially if they're in the field. So he was the lead developer of what we know now as MREs. So very well-known physiologist, very well-known scientist, and very well-known for his service to the United States government. So Ansel Benjamin Keys was the chief researcher on this particular experiment. And Ansel Keys spent a great deal of his career at the University of Minnesota, so it was at the University of Minnesota that they decided to actually conduct this experiment, hence the name. Also, other scientists on the study were Olaf Mikkelsen, a biochemist from the University of Wisconsin. He handled all the chemical analysis, blood analysis. You had Henry Longstreet Taylor, another PhD from the University of Minnesota, and he was mainly responsible for recruiting the 36 test subjects from conscientious objectors. He did all the pre-testing, all the questionnaires, and made sure they were fit for service, so to speak. Austin Henschel was a volunteer that helped with the blood testing of the volunteers. You then had Joseph Brozek, who was responsible for psychological studies during the starvation experiment. So not only were they, looking at their blood chemistry, their body, their muscle ratio, they were looking at their minds and their psyche as well. So he was the psychologist on the experiment. And so all of these scientists gathered these conscientious objectors. There was originally 400 men that volunteered for the experiment, and through questionnaires and testing, they culled it down to 36. Did all manner of experiments. We're talking like the, 1940s, 1940s version of what they maybe do on The Biggest Loser, with the bod pods and the complete, know your number, your projected age, age of death. They did all of that in the 1940s version. On these men, so they knew everything about these men before they chose the 36 to actually participate in the experiment, because they wanted no one that was sick, no one that was, they know that the general population in Europe, there's going to be sick people, but to start, they needed to know what it would do just to an average, healthy human man, since that was the standard. Now, this is the 1940s. We can talk about socio, policy at another time, but that was just the standard of the day. Now, of the 36 members, they ranged in age from 22 to 33 years old. They came from many of what you would expect among conscientious objectors. They come from the Mennonites, the Church of the Brethren, the Quakers. They also included some Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Jewish, Episcopalian, Disciples of Christ, and non-denominational. But mainly they all had a, actual registered reason why they didn't want to serve in the Army, but they were willing to do civil service, which is how they got here. They were already signed up with the civil public service and the selective service to do service at home. That's how they got into this starvation experiment. And the study was divided into approximately 4 phases. First, you had the control period. This was 12 weeks. This is where the 36 subjects were housed at the University of Minnesota. Many of them took classes. They were assigned to do a specific amount of physical and mental work per day to kind of mimic what an average daily life, would be out in the world. And they had strict testing. They were pedometers, early versions of them, and they were required to walk 22 miles a week and keep an extensive diary of what they ate, what they were feeling. And from that, they had, performance tests, x-rays, psychological evaluation, and they sort of standardized their total daily expenditure of calories. Now, most of these men came in between 3,000 and 3,200 calories per day is what they needed to maintain their current mass, muscle ratio, everything. They needed between 3,000 and 3,200 calories to maintain. And so after that was assessed, and it was assessed they were in their target weight, how many calories they needed, then it entered the second phase of the experiment, which was what was known as the semi-starvation phase, and this was 24 weeks. It began July 28th, 1945, and it was semi-starvation. Basically, their calories were cut from 3,000 to 3,200 down to about 1,560 calories a day. And it wasn't that they could eat whatever they wanted to, because this was a study to see how to refeed Europe mainly. They were fed the same things that the starving masses in Europe had access to: bread, cabbage, potatoes, macaroni. That's it. Very little meat. So you can imagine 1,500 calories doesn't sound like it's too bad. It's what, most people do for weight loss. But imagine if you were limited to cabbage, macaroni, bread, and potatoes only. So that's the main thing that they were fed. They were fed very strictly measured foods. They were fed in a group environment. And they were also allowed, because this is the 40s, they were allowed unfettered access to cigarettes and chewing gum early on. However, because such a drastic cut in calories and such limited foods, they were chewing a lot of gum. Some men were chewing up to 50 packs a day. So literally gum became a substitute. And so 𝐶𝐞𝐭'𝐬 and his people realized that each stick of gum had about 5 calories of pure sugar, and it was really throwing off the study, so they took away the gum. But they still had unfettered access to cigarettes. This is the 40s. During this starvation period, they were only fed twice a day, which is what they estimated that the average person living in Europe that was having problems was probably able to get. So it was very controlled. And they started seeing, because all these men were still required to walk 22 miles a week, keep a diary, go about their daily business. And some of them, as I said, were students at the University of Minnesota. So they were going about daily life. Think about when you're dining. Think about everything that you see. Life goes on. Well, they noticed psychologically, instead, they were losing weight. That was obvious. And even their muscle mass was dropping. That was obvious, because they weren't getting the right ratio of macronutrients to maintain a lot of protein to maintain their muscle mass. So they were losing fat and muscle. And they were, of course, becoming emaciated very quickly, because you cut their caloric needs in half. But they were also having very strange psychological issues. They became quite uninterested in relationships. They became quite uninterested in pornography. They became uninterested. Their libidos were replaced by a fascination and obsession with food. These men would buy cookbooks and sit and read them. Literally. Cookbooks. They would buy food for friends and family and sit and watch the friends and family eat the food. I mean, mukbang, anyone? It's literally because they couldn't have it themselves. They became obsessed with food. One participant even cut off 2 of his fingers. And after being psychologically, assessed, he said he doesn't remember really doing it, and he's pretty sure it was an accident, but he doesn't know. So they started having all these strange symptoms, just strange behavior. I mean, you think of a man with a Playboy. Well, this was a man sitting around with a cookbook, and even better if it had pictures. They just wanted to be around food. They became obsessed with food. So basically, according to 𝐋𝐞𝐭'𝐬, they were developing eating disorders very quickly. And I mean, this is the time before eating disorders were considered a disorder, but according to him, they were developing an unhealthy fascination with food. Let's just put it that way. Then it entered the third phase, a 12-week period known as restricted rehab, which is basically where they began to up their caloric calories from 1,560 to around 2,000 to 2,200. And they added in all the food groups. It was still controlled. It was still, 2 meals a day, but they had more of a variety. And they were still required to keep up with their normal activities. And they studied them during this 12 weeks. And even though the weight loss did not stop for most of them. Most of these men got very emaciated. There was even a Time magazine story about it where it showed how emaciated some of these men had become. And but the weight loss did slow down, but their psychological symptoms still manifested. It was still not enough. Many of the men said that during the starvation period, their bodies seemed to adjust, which we know that to be true, that the body will adjust, downplay the metabolism, and it will kill hunger pangs while you're in an active state of starvation. That's the reason that very, very low-calorie diets are not good. And so their hunger kind of stopped, even though their mental fascination with food. But once they entered this 2,000-calorie diet, they said the hunger came back. They said it was a hunger on a level they could not even describe. I mean, it made their obsession with food grow. And then after that was 8 weeks unrestricted, and they did not restrict caloric content, and they allowed them to eat whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, but just to monitor and record it. And most of the men said that during this period, they started rapidly regaining weight because they said their hunger was on a hormonal level. I mean, that's the only way to describe it. And now we know that if the body goes through extended periods of starvation, the body, to make sure that never happens again, will make you more hungry. That's the reason if you start eating in your own way after being on a diet, the weight comes back very quickly because your body's compensating for it. You have lower metabolism. And then not only that, your body is making you more hungry. The leptin, which is the hormone in the body that causes you to say, hey, I'm full, I'm done, it becomes underproduced. So these men started seeing that, and they rapidly regained the weight, and upon further study, what was realized is that their body composition was off. They became more fat. I mean, they lost a lot of muscle, and they became more fat. And even though it was meant to help people after World War II, the results were not even available until late 1946. And it was in a 1,300-page document, meticulously written and compiled by 𝐲𝐿𝐸 and his team. They talked about the 2 men that were dismissed for refusing to follow guidelines. And so the majority of the data was taken from the other 34 men. Basically, the results was that if the body goes through a period of starvation, your body will lower metabolism. It will not only use fat, it will use muscle in its bid to stay alive and not have to turn to using the vital organs. When refeeding begins, the body will begin mass storing of fat to compensate. So, and it will also make you hungrier. And this study did come out with what we know today as the basal metabolic rate, which is what you need just to breathe and exist. The amount of calories you would burn if you just woke up, sat up in bed, and sat there reading all day. That is what the number of calories your body would need. And then there's also the total daily expenditure, which is what you expend both basally and then with movement and activity. So we got the premise for those things out of the study. So it's been very beneficial, though it didn't help with what it was intended to do and how to refeed the starving people of Europe. So the subjects said that most of them did recover eventually from their obsession with food, and most of their bodies did eventually return to its normal state, though they said they never quite, got back to where they were more muscle than fat. That took a lot of time. But they did eventually recover from all the psychological effects, but it took years. Many of them said it took years. They also had studied things like edema, low iron, all that stuff on the body. So we got a baseline for a lot of things on this study. Was it a good experiment? I think for the time it probably was, and probably the best that could be done under the circumstances. But it's still very definitely mad medicine. Let me know down below what you think about this, and would you ever volunteer for such an experiment? And with that being said, I'll be back really soon with another video. And until next time, Keto Krime.